if you're about to format Windows, we're going to go over a pretty extensive checklist of things to do before you format, right? The plan here is maybe you're going to reinstall Windows, upgrade version of Windows, maybe you're switching over to native Linux. But yeah, there's all sorts of different things here to account for, so you don't forget to back up anything important. So I am running native Linux here. However, I was running Windows for over 20 years, and I've installed and formatted my fair share of Windows installations for myself, friends, family, etc. And there's always that sinking feeling in your stomach right after you push the button to format that you might have forgotten to back something up. So the steps here will hopefully, help you out there to avoid that feeling. And whenever I do a Windows installation here on a pre-existing system, I always do a full format there. I don't keep around personal files in between installations, so you are going to lose everything in between if you follow along like that. Now, with that said, in this video, we're kind of going to go over all these different bullet points here. I don't have a Windows installation to demo all that, but that's not really too important here because I think between all the different bullet points and talking over some extra stuff that's not here, I think you'll be well on your way. And yeah, these things aren't in order here, but let's start with your users directory here for Windows. So, it's going to be C users and whatever your name happens to be here. And while I didn't use these directories when I had Windows installed, a lot of people do. So, documents, pictures, videos, all that stuff, you might want to go and thoroughly check them out and then back up those files somewhere safe before you format. And also, there is this app data directory in here as well, but you might not see it by default. So in your file explorer, make sure to configure that to show hidden files and directories here, because this has all sorts of different files in here, cache files, temp files, but more importantly, config files, or it could also be saved game files, which we're going to go over in a little bit more later. But yeah, definitely don't skip this one. And it can be tedious to go through because it has a whole bunch of different subdirectories, but at least it will give you a really good reminder of things that you've either installed in the past, currently have installed, and also get a handle on some important configuration here. Then you might want to go through program files. There's going to be two different directories here, the one for x86, 32-bit programs, as well as the normal program files. And this will also give you a nice little reminder of the tools that you do have installed here. Sometimes important files can be saved in these directories. It really depends on the application here. But again, going through all these directories here is a really good idea. Then, for all the different tools that you use, applications, video editors, image editors, whatever you happen to be using, right? Think about how you've configured those applications, right? Those configs might be saved in your Windows users directory that you went above before. It could also be in program files. It could also be in the Windows registry. It really depends on the tool. These could be really important settings that you might not have touched in a while. For example, if you use something like OBS to record videos, there's a lot of really specific configuration in there around like bit rates and maybe even some like FFmpeg flags and stuff like that. And these are really easy to forget if it's something you did like 3.5 years ago. So, don't forget about that. And also, if you're having trouble figuring out where a tool has its configuration, maybe you've Googled around, you can't really find it, or maybe you just want to take the air quotes lazy way out there, you can always just take a screenshot of the settings page of those applications, or maybe take a picture of it on your phone or whatever, just have that backed up somewhere. So when you reinstall this program later, you'll be able to have those settings back. And then also, if you use your downloads directory as basically a dumping ground, then you might want to go through that in detail, right? I kind of do this, but I also periodically will, get things organized pretty nicely every, month or two or whatever. But yeah, there could be all sorts of different files in there. And really, it depends on your computer setup, right? If you have one single hard drive with one, Windows installation there, then yeah, that downloads directory would get wiped out if you were to do a full format. But if you have something like a secondary drive and maybe you have that downloads directory, on that second drive that you're not going to format, then maybe you don't need to worry about this too much, but still it's worth calling out there. Then also, and while, using Windows for over 20 years, I never really did this, but there could be some custom directories in your C drive. Maybe you created them, maybe some other applications created them. So you might want to just check there just to see if something is non-standard. Maybe there's certain config files and things to look at there. Also, maybe you like fonts here. I realize that should be a backslash, not a forward slash, whatever. I'll fix that in the blog post here. But yeah, if you have any custom fonts installed, then you can always go to Windows Fonts here and go and take a look here. Maybe you want to back those up as well. Then, yeah, inside of Windows System 32 drivers Etsy hosts file here, maybe you have some custom changes. This wouldn't be really something you would do. Maybe if you're a programmer, something like that, you're just modifying your host file. But again, you don't want to lose these things if you made these customizations, because if you're going to be reinstalling Windows later, then yeah, you want to put these modifications back. So definitely check that out here. And then, yeah, there's all sorts of different Windows settings. There's way too many to list here, but, this will at least get you thinking about the idea, right? This is things like your wallpapers and themes and, maybe your taskbar configuration and all sorts of different display settings, resolution, bit depth, and whatever else, right? Things like that. But then also, there's kind of not lower level, but other types of Windows settings and configuration as well, right? Maybe you have some scheduled tasks running, like maybe every Sunday you run this thing and that's set up through Windows. Maybe you have set certain environment variables or firewall rules, or maybe certain policy adjustments. Really depends, right? But these are things you might want to consider. And, hopefully just by being aware that these things exist, it kind of rejiggers your memory to be like, oh yeah, remember I did add some firewall rules. Let me go and back those up later so that at least I can reapply them when I reinstall Windows here. Then you might want to check out your startup folder here for anything you might have added. For example, if you have things like auto hotkey scripts being started up automatically, I've done videos about that in the past there. It's something to consider here, right? These are things that are going to start up automatically when Windows boots up. Then, you have things like browsers. And, some browsers do have features that allow you to stay signed in and they sync everything there to the cloud. But I kind of don't like doing that. So, I usually just export all the things that I really care about, right? Bookmarks and history and settings and passwords and things like that. Now, when it comes to exporting your passwords, that's really important, especially if you're not using a dedicated password manager. Even if you are using a password manager, it is kind of nice to export the passwords here just so you can import them after you do the reinstall, because I don't know about you, but I have, easily over 100 different username and passwords for various different sites. I don't want to have to go to each one and then go to my password manager, relog in, have it saved to my browser, etc. So just exporting that is really nice here. And then, that basically just saves some time here, right? But also, if you've done any custom settings here, having those exported could be helpful too, just to avoid needing to remember to reapply them. Then, besides settings there, core browser stuff, you also have things like extensions and themes that you might have installed. So, go and check out those configurations and at least get a list of all the different extensions that you might have installed here. In my case here, I basically just have uBlock Origin, that's it. But yeah, you might want to check that one out. Okay. Then when it comes to something like a password manager, if you're using a fully offline one, like pass on the command line or maybe KeyPass, which I happen to be using here, then that's going to be saved on the same partition that you're going to format. Then you'll want to absolutely back up that one for sure. Make sure that you have any passwords that you might need, your master password to unlock it, etc. And then if you're using a cloud-based one, again, just make sure you can still access it, right? That's really important. Definitely don't skip these steps here. Then when it comes to things like license keys, you might have them saved in a password manager. That's what I do here. But yeah, just make sure that you have all of them backed up somewhere. That includes having your license key for Windows itself. Even if you plan to wipe Windows and install Linux, it's still not a bad idea just to save your Windows license key, because who knows, maybe you'll need it in the future, or again, there's no harm just having that around, right? Then when it comes to certain sites like GitHub and others, you have things like MFA or 2FA, right? Maybe using something like Google Authenticator or something like that. But yeah, some of these sites here, they do allow you to download some one-time use recovery codes in case your 2FA device doesn't work anymore. So yeah, those recovery codes, it's a really good idea to back those up. Again, going back to this dumping ground, this wouldn't be a great idea, but maybe you downloaded those recovery codes to your downloads directory because maybe you didn't put them into a password manager. Technically you should be, because they are pretty important recovery codes. But in any case here, just make sure you have them backed up and don't forget them. Then if you're using something like Docker Desktop here, or maybe you have some volumes with important data in there, you might want to back that up there. Maybe also just go into your Docker Desktop settings, see how things are configured in case you did a whole bunch of customizations there, in case you don't want to forget and reapply those later. Then there's also WSL2, right? You might have one or more instances. I heavily used WSL when I was on Windows here, but yeah, you might want to go through all the different directories and files. For example, maybe you have source code or different tool configuration there that's not saved anywhere else. Could be difficult to find within Windows. So definitely don't forget that, right? You might want to start in your user's home directory here inside of WSL. And then don't forget to check those hidden directories too, because maybe you have things like SSH keys or your GPG key, or maybe some certain configuration here. There could be all sorts of different API keys and other things that you might want to have here. Beyond user config files, if you're planning to, recreate another WSL2 instance, if you don't have that like scripted out in some way, then you might want to go through whatever distros tools that are available here to find out what you have installed and configure there, so you can reinstall those things after formatting Windows and then setting that up again from scratch. Now we have some games here, right? You might have some saved games, and not all games are going to be synced to the cloud, right? If you're using Steam here. Now, when it comes to where they're located, it can be in all sorts of different spots here. It really depends on the game or launcher or whatever you happen to be using here. But yeah, typically it would be in your user's directory somewhere, but it could also be in documents. It might also even be in program files, under Steam user data. So go and check that one out. Then there could be something like custom device driver or device settings. For example, if you have something like an audio interface, that buffer size, so you're not getting crackles and pops and things like that. If that's something you set 5 years ago, could be hard to remember. So go and check those things out before you format. Those can also apply to, GPU settings or maybe network card, sound card, printers, stuff like that. Anything like that could be configured, and that would be a very good thing to have backed up. At the very least, maybe take a couple screenshots or write down a couple important things. You don't necessarily need to export files for some of them. Now, if you're using any old drivers for certain hardware, you just make sure you know where to download them from, or even better, if you still have the installation file, you might want to back that one up because, maybe the site that you downloaded that from 4 years ago existed then, but it no longer exists now. And then also it's really important to know, which version of Windows you have right now, as well as the version you plan to upgrade to, in case that happens to be different here. You can always go to System About there and then find out the details though, your Windows version, what build number, etc. here, because, if something goes wrong in the future after you format, after you reinstall whatever you're having, now you can be like, okay, I was previously using Windows XYZ build 123, and now after going to version X build Y, this tool that used to work doesn't. And at least you'll have a leg up on, confirming, okay, it definitely worked here, but now it doesn't work here, and you can narrow down the scope of the problem until you figure out what's wrong. Now, when it comes to upgrading to a newer version of Windows, maybe you're going from 10 to 11, or maybe some major release, then confirm the apps and tools that you're using are actually supported in the next version that you plan to use, because it would be pretty painful if you went through the steps of formatting, reinstalling everything, getting your whole system hooked up and ready to go, but then that one app that you really, really care about, it's a deal breaker for you, just doesn't work. So these are things you can kind of sort of get a good idea of before you actually format, right? You can just Google around and see what type of support there. You can look at these vendor tools here, whatever sites that they have, make sure that they have drivers or whatever you need for whatever operating system version you plan to use. Also, if you're planning to switch to Linux here, you may want to find some alternatives to tools that you really care about. For example, when I switched over, I really liked using Arfon View a lot on Windows, and it took me a bit, but MPV, which is actually a video viewer on Linux, it's really a media viewer because it's great at viewing images too. And then also like Foobar 2000 for listening to MP3s here, and now I'm using RMPC, and the list goes on here. I've done some videos about some of these tools, but yeah, this .fried rice project here, it already has a ready to go Linux desktop here with documentation on how to install Arch Linux and even set up a USB stick. So if you're interested in that, feel free to check it out here. And then before you actually do formatting, whether or not you're reinstalling Windows or going to Linux doesn't really matter here. Here's a couple of different tips along the way. So if it's been a really, really, really long time since your last format, you might want to consider cloning your drive before you format it, right? Assuming you have an extra drive or something like that. This way you have everything saved in a completely separate working drive in case you want to boot from it later. For example, maybe you install the new version of Windows, it's been running for a while, a couple of weeks, and then you realize like, oh man, like I forgot this one thing. Well, now you can go back and boot into this clone drive here, grab the one thing, back it up somewhere else, and then good to go. And then, once you're super happy with the new setup, then you can always get rid of that clone drive here to, use it for something else, right? Personally, I've actually never done this before, but, if you're not super experienced, it could be worth checking that one out. And then also, besides cloning your full drive, you should very much consider having some semi-automated way of backing up files, at least the ones that you care about, the ones that you can't lose. So for example, I use this rsync-based backup script here, BMSU, basically back my stuff up. It's a little shell script that I wrote some time ago, but yeah, I've been using a variation of this one for a very long time to back up and restore my life's work. So despite it being a shell script though, you can absolutely run it in Windows. I did for years there, not necessarily this script itself, but the precursor to it. But yeah, you can just run it from WSL2 and you can back up both your WSL2 files as well as Windows. Now, after backing up files, you'll definitely want to confirm they're there and actually readable. So being able to restore from your backup is a really good idea here. So you might want to do that before you even consider formatting or wiping your drive. And then also just don't rush, right? It's really worth spending 30, 60, 90 minutes, however long it takes to really go over all the steps above and potentially even more here, instead of quickly just running through everything, only to forget something really important to you after the damage has already been done. You've already formatted, maybe you didn't back something up because you didn't think about it. But yeah, just really go through this, right? It can't hurt. Well, I mean, what's an extra 30 minutes there if you're going to have a machine that's going to be running for, 8 years, 10 years, 12 years, whatever it happens to be. Also, if you have a few drives that are the exact same size and model, just to avoid confusion, you might want to disconnect the ones that you don't want to format, just so it's technically impossible for you to accidentally format the wrong drive. There are ways to differentiate this without needing to do that. But again, if you're not really experienced and you just want to play super safe, that's a move you can do that's worth spending the extra 5 or 10 minutes just to physically unplug them and then plug them back in later. Also, make sure the USB stick that you plan to install Windows from, if you're reinstalling Windows later, make sure that's in fully working state here. Also, if possible, have another computer or phone available for potential troubleshooting steps, right? Maybe something goes wrong with the installation. Maybe you're not really sure how to format this or do something custom. Maybe you want to set up a local user on Windows and the steps have changed. Now you need to look up the new way, etc. So yeah, that's basically it for this video here. Again, it's kind of meta stuff here. It doesn't really matter, but hopefully this gets you going here. And even if you're not going to be formatting Windows, you know, a lot of these steps here do apply to Linux and Mac OS as well. You know, a lot of this stuff, yeah, sure, there's going to be specific paths for Windows, but generally speaking, you know, coming up with a decently exhaustive list of things to consider before formatting is a really good idea, depending no matter what operating system that you're using. So with that said, you know, let us know your best tips. What do you do before formatting Windows here or anything? Do you have a different type of checklist? And with that said, if you have any questions, feel free to drop a comment below. I'll do my best to answer all of them. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.